Hey, I am Miguel Iturrate. Welcome back to the Cage Rage podcast, and this is the second segment of a new subject here on the CRP, and that's book reviews. And I've been looking at the Gulag Archipelago, obviously a classic historical book from the 20th century. It's actually a set of three books, and if you check the links and things down there, you'll see my review of the opening couple of chapters of the book. We're breaking it up piece by piece here at the CRP so that, I guess in modern times, if people aren't going to read the book, they might as well get a pretty in-depth review of it. So that's what I'm trying to do here. At any rate, the first edition that we did, and you can find out there on YouTube, and I'd appreciate if you check it out. That first edition there covered chapters 1 and 2, and that's basically the history of the sewage disposal system and arrest. The first chapter is called Arrest, and the second one is the history. And it basically starts to immerse you into the idea of how the Gulag and the system of oppression under Stalin was everywhere. And so you're starting to get into some details there. Now, however, I got myself here to a point where we went 24 minutes on the first video, and I missed one very important part of the second chapter, the history of the sewage disposal system. Wanted to read it now. It's basically Article 58, Section 10 of the code, and this is, the one that they get you with in terms of this is the charge that's so all-encompassing that, basically anybody could be brought up on charges here. And it basically reads, propaganda or agitation containing an appeal for the overthrow, subverting, or weakening of Soviet power, and equally the dissemination or preparation or possession of literary materials of similar content. So, very, very wide-ranging net there, obviously, subverting and weakening the government, it goes on to say, subverting and weakening the government could include any idea which does not coincide with or rise to the level of intensity of the ideas expressed, in the newspaper on any particular day. After all, anything which does not strengthen Soviet power must weaken it, right? So this is a rabbit hole here, The section ends with, does not completely coincide, it subverts. And he who sings not with us today is against us. Very interesting. So that'll wrap up part one. And I'm sorry to digress a little bit for that, but I wanted to include the reading of 5810. I think it's very important. So now we get on to the next section. The next section is the interrogation. And, in chapter 3 is the interrogation. Chapter 4 is the Bluecaps. The Bluecaps would be the guys doing the interrogating, right? The NKVD or the secret police, so to speak. So the chapters are very closely tied together here, and obviously we've made some notes and things like that. So, one final thing, that was set up here in the history and things to close out the section 1. There were very few, reversals or like, okay, you can go free now. And when that happened, they sort of made it, known so that it was like taken as a confirmation. It happened during a review, and we found that this one was incorrect. So therefore, during the review, all the other people in jail, it's kind of like taken for granted and affirmed that they're incorrectly. These guys are being released for whatever reason. That happened extremely rarely, right? So at any rate, so now once you're there, and part of the point of being freed at some point is if you're free, they'll just arrest you again, there are instances of that happening, and or they could watch you, surveillance and stuff like that. They loved all those little tools and things, So now for chapter 3, the interrogation. Now here's where still the history of the Gulag gets muddled with that of the Tsars, because the Tsars had that reputation for cruelty before, and for being the worst of the worst. And, they had a handful of political prisoners throughout, and, some were exiled and things like that. I don't think any were ever shot. And, it was a situation where what the communists did, what Lenin did and Stalin, reaffirmed was basically they said, look, we're going to be hardcore on these guys. If they're the enemy, we're not going to show any mercy, and we're going to get this revolution done, in as quick and efficient a manner as possible. I think that at least was the intent. That turns into, things like, shooting people on the spot, or, considering drunks right along with, because they disrupt society, right along with, real political adversaries and things like that. So at any rate, by the time you've gotten, into Stalin's era, and we're talking about the actual Gulag and that repression, in the Bluecaps, chapter, he outlines the fact that he considers a lot of these guys were ignorant. That a lot of the ways that you survive here was by not asking a lot of questions and by being able to march to that beat of that same drum and being able to look like you're doing it fervently and things like that. So, a lot of the interrogations, they become, a guy who doesn't know why he's been arrested, and needs information against the guy who completely, has a completely different agenda. And the agenda is that, he says it in the book, the bottom line is you're talking about, pro wrestling here. You're talking about predetermined outcomes when it comes to interrogation. They already knew what they were going to get, So it was almost like a cat and mouse game where they were having fun and that sort of stuff, with the interrogations. Some interrogations that he documented began with, so why do you think you're here? Let's have some fun. Why do you think you're here? And maybe you give me something good, or maybe you hit the nail right on the head, or whatever the situation is. So it wasn't a good situation there. And the interrogation now, from arrest to interrogation, you're looking at a completely open book. You could be waiting 6 months to be interrogated, or your interrogation could take 6 months in terms of, it comes with a wave of guys asking questions, and then tomorrow more, and different people and different angles on it. And the whole thing of it was, really not to gain information. And that's the interesting part, because when you consider interrogation, and Solzhenitsyn makes this point, obviously, right? But when you consider interrogation, the idea is, let's get more info. Now, granted, they would take any name you gave them, and they'd work on it, and they would do, work on it that way. But the point is that when it comes down to the individual, you and your interrogation, the idea here is to wear you down. The idea here is to put you through a process that you just become a robot, and, at the end, you'll sign a confession, And we're in a situation where, he gives an example in the book where a certain group of people was arrested and sent to Archangel. Now, Archangel is, the northern regions of Russia, probably one of the coldest cities in the world, right? And what you're talking about there is all 40 went up there and they confessed, to some type of distribution of pamphlets and being a group, that was decimating, anti-Soviet information. And all 40 of them confessed. And later on, it became apparent that the point is a separate group was actually responsible for the flyers, and they were later arrested as well. Which means that all 40 of those guys that confessed in the original round were coerced confessions that they just said, oh, "Yeah, I did it," after being put through whatever they were put through. So yeah, you can switch that around. Another. One particular officer in one of the jails that was a prevalent interrogator, apparently, or one that he found a lot of information on, he used to do the interrogations with a gun, his loaded gun sort of on his desk, pointed in your general direction, not in his hand, but just a subtle reminder there. In page 108, I noted this because it's incredible. The point is to wear you down, right? Here's an example that leads you to that conclusion. When you're sitting in jail, you're Solzhenitsyn, and you're having a moment with another inmate, and he shares with you a story of this nature. What do you do with it? It's like there's certain circumstances where I don't know. Lying. Yeah, I guess there could be embellishment and certain things in some of these, but they all also ring so truthfully in the way he writes and things, which is one of the reasons I'm a fan of the book and a fan of of the writing here. But this incident, page 108, is a guy who spent 12 hours. He was in his cell. They come in. They wake him up after interrogation starting. 12 hours of, now he goes to the interrogation room. He gets sat down there. He waits a minute. The interrogator comes in, ignores him for about 10 minutes, looking at papers and stuff. Doesn't say a word. No words are exchanged. And then he gets on his walkie-talkie and says, come take him away. And he goes back to his cell. Now, back in his cell, they give him about 5 minutes. And boom, again, hey, your interrogation is about to start. You're going back out there. And he spent 12 hours repeating this process. Why? Just to wear you down. It also shows, I think it also reaffirms the general idea that, dumbness was winning out. That, this is the kind of wear you down tactic that's just so rudimentary and stuff that, you just, I don't know, I can't believe, and he can't either. What Solzhenitsyn points out is that, under the czars and, previous to the 20th century and some modicum of human rights and stuff like that, but especially the czars, because those are Russians, they never dreamed of doing stuff like that. They never, forced arrests and, this kind of thing. And then, that type of just dumbness, he gives an example of one of the guys under the Tsar who was responsible for arrests and putting people in solitary, actually going to spend time in the solitary confinement cell and, reflecting on what it must be like and that sort of stuff. Just gives you an idea that he was a human being, and, obviously the communists and the NKVD didn't have that sort of humanness, so to speak, at least according, to Solzhenitsyn's take, and, the torture that comes with an interrogation, here he backs it up a little bit. Yeah, you get extreme tortures at times, there may be individual stories as we continue here, but here he outlines, and this also is the kind of thing that makes sense and is the kind of thing that tells you why this thing lasted so long. It's just subtle techniques that are not very hard to apply. If you want to say, we will, build a wheel and stretch them on the wheel like a rack. I mean, then you got to build a wheel, and it's like you got 5,000 prisons across the country. What are you going to do? We'll put wheels in 2,000 of them and stretch them. Now you're talking resources and stuff like that. And his point is these guys are cruel and very simple. Lack of sleep, lack of food, over water. It was a particular one where they just force you to keep drinking water. Sitting is another one. He describes being asked to sit in a high chair where your feet don't touch the ground, and being asked to sit in a high chair for 6 days. The documented story there. Try that for 6 hours sitting there. It's uncomfortable and stuff, but it's very simple. And all it takes is a couple of guys to watch them, and when they get tired, they can go off and have a cup of coffee and give another guy the watch. Meanwhile, the guy's sitting on that chair, right? So, very simple stuff. I was interested by, they had beds where, they let the bed bugs accumulate, and they would torture you by putting you in there. And there was one story that they grabbed me where he had been with the bed bugs. They got into his clothes and stuff, and he got up and he started, rubbing himself against the wall and, to try to crush them and break them up, And, eventually there were so many bed bugs that in the book says he just gave up and let the bugs drink his blood, So it's just, again, a tribute to his writing. The way he tells the stories and stuff like that is very much, a reminder that you were in a cruel hell, and it was, not something that had a lot of explanations or logic or anything like that. You're subject to, people working in a system with, an agenda and things like that. The interesting thing is he also points out, after a wave here, and he's talking about the Bluecaps. These are the guys doing the interrogation. At some point, you might go and be like, yeah, we're not getting anything anymore. We've arrested just about everybody, And I mean, they had, at times 15 million people in the system, right? No way they couldn't say that. There's no way that they could come out and be like, yeah, we're not finding anything. They had to find something, or else they'd be the next guys found. And the Bluecaps chapter actually ends with the fact that some of them did get put into the system. They were just like regular people trying to survive, and in many ways, when they aged and they've been around for a long time and things like that, with new guys coming up more cutthroat, they also played and lived in a very dangerous world there. Maybe they had the advantage over the inmates, but it doesn't sound like a comfortable way or surroundings there for any of these people. Other little punishments, they'd apply a bridle like a horse. Give you a wrapped up piece of paper or a piece of leather and just force you to bite it at the end there. They would, if you were arrested and other people are involved, the other guy might not be arrested, but you in your cell, they'll parade him outside, tell him, look, hey, we need you to do something. He goes, and then you think he's arrested. They use that in the interrogation. At times they were arrested. At times they did speak. At times they did know something, but they could always use. They didn't need. They weren't restrained by having to not lie. So they can lie and say, yeah, we've arrested your whole family. You want them out, and this, that, and the other stuff. So and loneliness is another one where they could just the isolation cells. They can leave you alone. Loneliness creeps up on you in many different ways too. Solzhenitsyn describes, because you could be in a cell with other people, but there's the snitch, and this guy here, is an antisocial, and you're actually alone, and you have nobody, nothing going on as well. So loneliness, they'll use any one of those things. And who can you trust in that system? Who's not at the end of their rope and willing to betray somebody to better their lot in life, and that must happen a lot. Another interesting thing about the interrogation. So tell me why you think you're here. Another tactic that they use, which is just unbelievable. How do you argue with this stuff? It's like, all right, we think you were part of this meeting, in anti-Soviet meeting or get together of a political party. No, I wasn't. All right, prove you weren't there. Now the onus is on you to prove your innocence, or obviously the saying rings a bell to all Westerners as innocent until proven guilty. And here you've got an instance where the exact opposite is what's going on. And so yeah, just to prove you weren't, that comes up during the interrogations and things. Now, getting back to the Bluecaps again, he stated that they're not smart, and we've already covered a little bit about how they also played a dangerous game and lived in a dangerous world. He likens it, to actually them living like Zeks themselves, like they live by the thieves' credo. The thieves that were in jail are a whole different subculture, basically, than to like the people arrested for politics or other types of things. The thieves had their own, infrastructure, basically, and they were a very powerful force. The Bluecaps would use thieves, and then there are times where, the thieves that they used and things wound up, the Bluecap gets put into jail, and then all of a sudden now they're over him, and things went bad depending on the type of person that the Bluecap had been. One of the things that interested me about it is, is they never use the word torture. Obviously, torture is, not a word that you want associated with your jail system or anything like that. So torture is not the word. So they had a code word, persuasion. So persuasion, you're gonna we're gonna need more persuasion for this guy, and that inevitably meant probably something horrific. In page 160, he asks himself, what would his life had been like if when he was arrested in the military, of his medals and things, if he kind of gotten a buy, maybe or in some of the cases where he may have been a step away from a promotion, maybe they would have made him an actual Bluecap, an actual officer, for interrogations and things like that. I mean, he was smart and he was capable of things. So he asked himself, would he have turned into a Bluecap? Would he have turned into one of these guys here that just is, basically trying to preserve himself, but doing it in a heinous way where you're actually taking people down and, the ability to abuse and things like that. And, so the question is would, he, under the Soviet system, the system encourages you to turn people in and all that. Would he have just turned into, if he hadn't been arrested, now obviously with the arrest, you become, your soul cries out kind of thing, and you become a voice, right? So we know his voice, but what if it had been different? Would he have just become one of these Bluecaps, And his answer, I'm going to read it to you directly because his answer is scary. It's an amazingly insightful man. He says, so as to whether he would have behaved under certain circumstances the way his jailers behaved with him, it is a dreadful question if one answers it honestly. So he doesn't, he thinks the system was powerful, and that inevitably to save your own skin, that's a very powerful incentive as well. So that's what's there. It is a dreadful question if one answers it honestly. So Solzhenitsyn being powerful there, that obviously on the Bluecaps we mentioned, some of them always wound up in the Gulag as well, and there were stories there. Let me see here. Yeah, and the author also talks about, during his arrest, he gives us a little bit of insight. And this is one of those things, again, where the ignorance comes in, He thinks it could have been much worse for him because, they had the correspondence with the letters and stuff. But keep in mind, he was a writer and an educated guy, known as, a mathematician and stuff like that. So, the letters, he poo-pooed, boss Stalin and stuff like that, and that got him arrested. But now, when they arrested him, and they took all his things, now he saw they had something that he called his war diary. And that was, books that he had written, and who knows what interpretation that material could have received, but it wasn't going to be good for Solzhenitsyn, And, alas, in history, that particular war diary is lost because the NKVD, in this case, didn't read it. They burned it. They just burned it wholesale, didn't even look at it, didn't even give it credit. And who knows, what type of documentation that was that would have enhanced, the story that we already know. I mean, if he was keeping a diary while during the war, this would have been like the most fresh accounts without having to count on memories and things like that. So truly a loss there. And but again, it goes to show, their job was done. The guy he was already arrested, already heading for 10 years of making bricks. And, he didn't even bother to read his full writings. And he said, maybe he gets a 25 or maybe he gets shot on the spot with what was in those war diaries. And they're gone now. So that was one of those things there. And, I'm going to close it here. The damage done with just that particular stuff, the destruction of, the culture, of the intelligence of the Russian people, which is mighty. It was an old culture, and they were interested in education, arts, and things like that, And, the 20th century now, Stalin and this wave of the Gulag hits. And I'll close with this here. Solzhenitsyn laments that, and I quote, "Our descendants would consider our generation more stupid, less gifted, less vocal than it actually in fact was." And so much was destroyed that, voices have probably been lost. And that's to the detriment probably of all humans, And, at any rate, I'm Miguel Iturrate for the CRP. This has been a review of the next few chapters 3 and 4 of the Gulag Archipelago. We're looking at the one of the powerhouses of 20th century literature, in my opinion. Obviously, it's a historical book having to do with Stalin and his reign of terror in Russia. And it ties into modern news, and the mindset. Always good to talk about different points of view and different ways people grew up. And, the Russian people definitely grew up very different than the Westerners. One of our primary interactions was this book that was published in the 60s. And, reading it again now in 2019, it's still as relevant and powerful today as it was back then. So we will continue this series. Please like and subscribe. Check out part 1. It's out there on YouTube, and you can look for part 3 here in the next couple of days. Thank you very much.